Welcome to Call Your Hits, a Storm Riders Airsoft podcast. Thanks for joining us, everyone. My guest today is Kirby, one of the members of the Storm Riders team here in Newfoundland, and my partner in organizing our latest event, Operation Phantom Shield, which we'll get to in a little bit. Before we dive into it, let me introduce Kirby to you. Kirby's been playing Airsoft for well over a decade, and he actually attended a few Storm Riders events back in the day with his own team. Namely, he was commander at Operation Dark Crescent back in 2014. He joined the Storm Riders after his own team dissolved a few years after that. But over the last few years, Kirby has been an integral part of our big event games, namely acting as our scientist, which was a central part of the gameplay experience at Operation Last Refuge Spore Cloud. So he's seen firsthand how the different game elements we use have worked out with our field and our community, especially like how players are interacting with them. So when I wanted to organize a more Milsim roleplay heavy event, and I also wanted to give Pat a break, Kirby was a natural choice for that. So over the last few months, and it has been months now, Kirby and I have been working diligently, let's call it, to craft this event such that it will deliver a completely new and engaging experience for almost all of our player base. Most of our players, as I've mentioned in the past on the show, this is like their first few years playing Airsoft. Many of them, it's actually their first year. So they've never experienced anything like this. So what we're going to be doing at this op is incorporating Milsim elements in a way that we haven't really done it before. We're really pushing some stuff further down the Milsim path, and we'll talk about that. Now, at the time of recording, Operation Phantom Shield hasn't happened yet, so it's happening next weekend. But by the time you're listening to this, it's already happened. So we're actually going to be able to go through some of the finer details of the event with you today, what kind of surprises players can expect, and walk you through some of the game sort of design decisions that we made and why. And there's a few choice decisions, I think, that make this an event that's going to be hopefully one to remember for most of our players. So all that being said, with a really long wind up, Kirby, welcome. And thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. First time officially getting to be a part of this. I've sort of hidden the background of some of the videos in the past. So
definitely. And I mean, it's so good to be able to involve you. And it's been really, really cool working with you for the last couple of months to get stuff off the ground. Just, by virtue of the fact of just even being a sounding board sometimes, be like, hey, I have this idea. And you'd be like, no, Phil, that's a stupid idea. Which happened at least one time.
I think it was only once, though, in fairness. I think it was only once.
But why don't we get you to actually talk through sort of the overall event concept so that people who are listening sort of get the basic premise of what it is that we're doing?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Yeah, so for this event, like as you mentioned, is the whole idea. We kind of put a big spin on this one, which is very different from Operation Touchdown, which happened earlier this year, where the concept was sort of very simple, like, hey, get the Storm Riders across this line, you score a point. Like that was the whole concept of Touchdown. And for this one here, after the feedback from Touchdown, it was a lot of people wanted a more Milsim experience. And that's where we of course, put our heads together and sort of seen like, okay, how could we deliver that, but not sort of overcomplicate it as well? Especially because, as you mentioned, a lot of our players this time around, it is their very first year actually playing Airsoft and getting exposure to something like this. And so we ended up, I mean, with a lot of the brainstorming that happened, like a lot of the heavy lifting on your side, I was glad I was able to pitch in from part to part here. But yes, I mean, with the whole idea of the PRN coming into play, or the People's Republic of Newfoundland faction. So they, after Operation, I believe it was Neon Sunrise, which I unfortunately didn't get to attend, they ended up winning that event. So they ended up getting control of the village for this event, which was going to be interesting to sort of see like how that actually plays out for them. And, actually having control of that central location of the field being such a big part of Frontline's field in a whole. And, a big thing for them, of course, is that with this event and what we talked about for a lot of their objectives for them was that it was very much just like locating intel and gathering these hardware resources all over the frontline field. And that was something we wanted to do, is make sure that we could utilize areas of the field that we tend not to utilize very often, such as
Definitely.
Thunderdome and areas like that. So, giving them objectives to where they would have to actually go around that area of the map. And then also looking at getting them involved with the villagers. So, because we had role players this time around, which was super cool. And of course, everyone wanted that after Operation Touchdown was a big part of the feedback. So, having them sort of start with bad relations by default, or at least lower standard relations with the villagers, and then sort of having to earn trust by completing some pretty, what we're hoping is in-depth objectives, like having to go and do fuel runs for the villagers by filling up the fuel bottle constantly from the administration building and transport that, or having to go and carry a villager who has a busted leg or help him through the woods and stuff. So a big
Yeah,
part of
because
that just kind of offering objectives where there was the potential for contact, but also being the fact of like, hey, you might do 2 objectives in a row and you might not have contact.
yeah, and it was so important for us to do something of that nature that took away this idea of we just have to fight the enemy all the
Yeah.
time. Because our frontline field, like you were mentioning, I mean, firstly, it's pretty small. Like we've talked about
Yeah.
this before, but like the field is not very big. Like
Yeah.
it's probably what, like 300 feet wide, and maybe like 9 or 1,200 feet long. Like it's not super
Yeah.
big. And so what would historically would just happen would the forces would sort of meet in the middle and just fight there, and then the
Yeah.
whole rest of the field doesn't get utilized. And we really wanted to come up with a way that sort of forced the teams to utilize the rest of the field
Mm-hmm.
by making it so the objectives were all around the field. So this is sort of what you're talking about, right? It's
Yeah.
like figure out ways to utilize the field. But one of the things that we decided to do as well very early on was to keep the objectives hidden, right?
Yeah.
So in terms of what the teams need to do, that's on the team's their own op org, right? So what was cool, we've never really done that before either, having like an actual op org document for either team
Mm-hmm.
that is heavily pilfered from the American Milsim op orgs that I saw. I used that as a bit
Right.
of a template, and I used some op org templates I found online, just mishmash some stuff together to make it seem like Milsim E, by including like primary, secondary, tertiary objectives, right?
Yeah.
Quaternary, quinary objectives, and using big words or like acronyms that sound military to get people sort of in the mood. But the content of it, like if you just take out all the fluff, it's basically just telling you like these are your objectives for the
Mm-hmm.
day. This is where your respawns are, and just police your trash. Basically, it's like that's
Yeah.
the only important
Yeah.
stuff in the op orgs. And by doing that, I feel like we've created an environment where the teams are going to play the objective and not just try and fight the enemy. Because at the end
Yeah.
of the day, that actually isn't one of the objectives for PRN. So we've got the PRN, which you were just talking about, the People's
Yeah.
Republic of Newfoundland. And then we have the other team, the ACM, which is the Association of Confederated Municipalities. And like they have completely separate objectives. And one of
Mm-hmm.
the things we talked about this as well pretty early on, and even as early as even today, we were sort of fleshing out what that looks like. But
Yeah.
there's a possibility that both teams complete their objectives, or both teams sort of win, or I guess both teams equally lose. I don't know how you, but basically that there is no clear winner at the end of the day by virtue of these, these hidden objectives, right?
Yeah. And it's actually interesting because when you had mentioned that today, I actually kind of took a minute and I was like, you know what? Like, that is really likely that could be the outcome.
Mm-hmm.
Because like looking at how it's structured, and like where of course this overall objective of assembling a SAM site, of course, is the ACM's overall objective of the day, is to
Yeah.
gather all these components from around the map, or maybe obtain them from the villagers and stuff like that, or maybe have to steal them from PRN, who knows. But then the fact of like having these components is one thing, but then having to truck and lug these to a designated place on the field, and then have to assemble it in that designated place, which is not the easiest location in the world to make this happen in.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why like that whole factor of like they might get the components, but by the time that the whistle blows at the end of the day, they might not ever assemble that missile.
Yeah. And
So
and like we went extra because, as I like to say, when something's worth doing, it's worth overdoing. So we have this
right.
very large missile that I've built
Yeah.
out of like 3.5-inch PVC pipe, and I've decorated it, painted it. Chris 3D printed some fins. I've got some
Yeah.
decals and some like stencils printed on it, and we have like a mounting platform for it, like on a basically like on a tripod. And so what Kirby was talking about in terms of collecting the components, that's what we're talking about. So we've got the missile is going to be in one place. It's going to be hidden with the villagers, and they're going to have to figure out a way to acquire it later on in the day. But then they're going to get intel on, okay, well, you can get the flight control laptop, you can get the the launching platform, you can get like a flight controller or like whatever, and you're going to have to gather all of this stuff while also trying to prevent it from getting into the enemy's hands and then assemble it. And the thing is, the other team, so ACM is trying to build this missile. PRN has no idea that that's what their objectives are.
Yeah.
They have an idea that they've got munitions components, but they don't know what they look like. They don't know what they actually are supposed to be or what they're going to do with them, etc. So really, PRN sort of has to focus on their objective, which is controlling their fob. And as a bit of an Easter egg for some of our listeners who are in the know, the field that we call the village historically, that is actually going to be the fob, and it's going to be called, or it is called, Fob Pineland. And the little village, which is basically a small field with like 4 different buildings or 5 different buildings, that's going to be the actual village where the local forces are, and we're calling that village Robin Sage. So if you know, you know. But so they have control of this Fob Pineland, and we have identified certain key structures in that village or in the Fob that the other team is going to try and blow up. And so their job is to protect the Fob and make sure those buildings don't get blown up.
Yeah.
Thing is, it's not actually ACM's objective to blow up any building in that in the Fob. So they're responding to a threat based on intel that doesn't actually exist. Now, if ACM wants to, they certainly can blow up buildings because we're going to give them C4. I think you said you made a brick. You made a C4 brick by wrapping it in aluminum
Just
foil.
Wrapped it. Actually, it was really funny. I literally didn't have duct tape. I had like this weird tuck tape that was labeled tuck all over it.
Okay.
So I had to wrap it in tuck tape, and then I took a black can of spray paint and just went to town on it because I was like, well, I can't just say tuck all over.
Yeah, clearly. That's awesome. Yeah. So yeah, like, we can talk about the props in a bit, but like we're going to give them this C4, be like, hey, if you put this in a building, you can blow it up. And when you blow it up, like, we'll detonate some sort of like firework or like maybe one of the loud banger grenades that I have. It doesn't really matter. But point is, they could do that if they want. I think one of the big things that you and I were talking about is also this idea of like emergent gameplay, like just let them do stuff, whatever. Like if they have an idea, like let them do that and give them a space to operate in, like by giving them, props, by giving them NPCs who have like potentially have missions, like maybe you do them, maybe you don't, like how you interact. So yeah, I'm curious from your perspective, like what are some of the things, because as well, like one of the things that we are going to be doing in this op is Kirby. I'm going to be just purely game admin. Like that's the only thing I'm going to do. Kirby is going to be game admin light, but also keeping the villagers sort of in check in terms of keeping them consistent. Because I think that's one thing that we had a problem, not a problem, I guess, but what, in the past, it's been a little wacky, right?
100%. I mean, like it's like I'm on one side of the village in the past, giving red team a really hard time, and then blue team it's a cakewalk on the other side of the village, and it's kind of like, okay, well, there needs to be a little bit of balance to this. Now, so it's gonna be interesting. Of course, we've also reduced the amount of villagers. Like in the past, I mean, we've had anywhere from 5 to 10 villagers potentially, and now I believe there's only 3 of us. Right this time around. So just on that villager side, it's going to be just really interesting to see how the teams approach us, because the thing about it is that for PRN is that like for them, they almost have to, because throughout the day, like a couple of their first objectives is to scout the village and then to actually make contact with the village. Where for ACM, I mean, realistically, I mean, if ACM is getting all these objectives around the map and stuff for this, they could come talk to the villagers, and it's nice for them to maintain good relations with the villagers. But the thing is that there's almost no real direct necessary reason for them to be like, hey, like we have to go to the villagers like at this certain point. They kind of have a little bit more freedom. It's like, do we really want to go talk to them, or do we just want to go do our thing on the map?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's going to be interesting to sort of see how each of the commanders, Cal and Aaron, sort of how they approached the day.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm sure they obviously have their plans, and it's going to be interesting to see how the changes they have to make, obviously, with how the map shifts and how the objectives get called and stuff like that. But
Well, and
yeah,
that's really interesting too, because again, both Aaron and Cal work with the Canadian Armed Forces, right? That's
yes,
their job, and they're both in the army specifically,
yeah,
and so they're very familiar with things like op wards. They're
hmm,
familiar with fragos. So one of the things that we are doing in addition to the actual the op wards and the objectives is basically every hour ish, they're going to be getting fragos.
yeah,
And so, for those who don't know, Frago is basically a fragmented order, or like it's just basically in the context of a Milsim at Airsoft, it's just basically a mission, right? It's a specific mission that you're going to go and accomplish within certain parameters. So, again, we've gone full tilt by writing them up, by having the orders signed by a fictional, major, or I don't know what rank I gave them, probably lieutenant colonel or something like that. Regardless, like I've got all this written up, but on their end too, because they bring that experience from like, oh yeah, this is what we do at work. They have their own ordbats, right? There's their orders of battle, right?
yeah,
Created, which is basically their roster, right? It has them
yeah,
as their IC, and then their two IC, and then their squads, including like their SSWs, their
hmm,
bolt actions, their whatever DMRs, etc. Right? Like all that is laid out, and they have created their own fragos as well for their own teams. So they're going to get the fragos from high command, and then they're going to assign missions. And one of the things that's going to be interesting is how players respond to that, because for many of them, again, they've never seen anything like that before.
hmm,
So the first mission that you were just talking about for PRN is going to be to go and like do basically a recon mission, right? Go observe, report back, do not engage.
yeah,
Meanwhile, ACM is going to be going around the field trying to locate munitions components. One of the things that we're doing for ACM2, which we haven't talked about, but is going to be a big, big, big surprise, because we were talking about this ahead of time, is the PRN are going to respawn from Fob Pineland. ACM is going to respawn from two locations on the field
yeah,
at either ends of the field. Because again, one of the things that often happens is you start on this side, we start on that side, we'll meet in the middle, and that's done.
hmm,
By having them spawn at both sides, whichever they want at any given time, it prevents that from happening. Because if one team goes all the way to one side, you can just go and respawn at the other side. You come out from that side, and now that force is forced basically to defend on two sides. And we were
yeah,
talking about what we should do with that information, because I got to see Cal's order of battle, including his initial orders, and I was
yeah.
thinking, should I do something with that, right?
Yeah, and so it's gonna be interesting just to see like how on the field, like how Cal and Aaron, like how they sort of alter their plans, like their plan of action, like in the moment. Because, like for example, I mean, you mentioned about the one that Cal posted, and I took a read of it as well, and just seeing where he's like, oh yeah, we're gonna flood our forces like up through Thunderdome and D-Day, which has been a typical thing in the past. So if your team controls the village, that you usually lock down D-Day. But it's going to be interesting to see how that plan alters when all of a sudden he finds out the hard way that, oh, boogers, ACM is literally spawning on D Day.
Yeah. And
Right?
also on the other side of me. So if I push
Yeah.
up, if I push up the field, which is east, but regardless, very
Yeah.
quickly you will be encircled. You'll have people on both of your sides,
Yeah.
which is again not typically not something players at our field ever experience,
Yeah.
because you generally only you start here, we start there, and that's it,
Yeah.
right?
And the thing is, in the past, I mean, everyone has sort of known where they're going to start to. It's like, hey, one team starts Blackhawk, one team starts Thunderdome. Like it's been kind of like said in like during our safety briefings and everything, where the teams are going to start. Now, obviously, for ACMs, they know where PRN is going to start.
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously, the thing that they have going is that PRN has multiple different respawns in the village and stuff like that. So they have that factor. But it's interesting because PRN, in a way, they have the fob was their reward as for winning at Neon Sunrise, but they still are a little bit at a disadvantage because of the fact that cool, you have the village, but you have people spawning on both sides of you. So I'm really looking forward to see how that gets handled. And I think, but the thing I realized about this op is that while I think there's going to be a lot less contact than I think what people are anticipating. But I could be wrong, but we'll see.
What makes you think that?
I think that the PRN is going to strongly focus on keeping the village locked down. I think that if they can send out small reconnaissance teams to do objectives, I think that's going to be their go-to. I don't see them putting a full force out onto the field. And I feel ACM is going to realize that, okay, like, we need these components. These components are scattered all over. Well, we can't collect these components if we're constantly in combat.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I'm leaning with it. And again, I could be absolutely wrong, but we'll see.
Yeah, I don't think you're necessarily incorrect. I think one of the things is they have to collect. So, from a lore perspective, like, what exactly is going on here? They are trying to recover components that have been stashed by what we're calling ACM CAG, right? So ACM Covert Activities Group or whatever. I don't know, like some acronym. But like, if you know about CAG, I think CAG is the former name of Delta or something. Anyway, not important. ACM CAG has stashed its components. Well, where will they have not been able to stash them? Obviously in the fob, right?
Yeah.
They can't stash them somewhere that the enemy has control of. So there are no components in the fob. So really, there is no reason for PRN to attack the fob to get components because they're not in there. And I don't know if they're going to think about that, firstly, right? Now, all of this is in the lore, in the documents that we've provided to them. So they could put two and two together and go, hey, hang on. If they've left caches for us, it's unlikely they left them with the enemy, right?
Yeah.
So they might put two and two together and realize that they don't have to do that. Now, if the other team finds them and takes them back to the fob, they may want to go in and try and retrieve them, especially if they're important components. But I think you're probably not too wrong. I think that they are, especially ACM, they're probably going to avoid or try and avoid being in contact, especially in the early moments, right? Yeah. Because on the flip side, the fragos for the PRNs, like you mentioned, like, we are asking them to do the recon mission, but after that, they have to do a KLE, a key leader engagement, where they go and engage with the village elder, who is going to be Jeremy, which is going to be wild. Because for those of you who are not in the know, Jeremy is one of our Storm Riders as well. And he is a really good role player. He's a fantastic dungeon master at D&D. He can do all kinds of crazy voices, and I'm sure he will, and all this kind of stuff. And it's going to be up to him. I've given him a whole briefing on, like, hey, this is what the villagers want. This is your motivation. This is how you should act, etc. This is our first time actually trying to keep it all organized by using, like, I don't know how you would describe it, but like an NPC, like, affinity scale that basically says, like, on a scale from 1 to 10, how much do they like one person versus another? Because I found, and you can talk about this, but I found that in the past, it's been like kind of either we totally like you or we totally don't like you. And that can switch, like, at a moment's notice. Like, was that your experience when you were being, like, a villager, or even just seeing how the villagers were interacting with them at Spore Cloud when you were a scientist?
Yeah. So when I remember during the very first event last year, Last Refuge 2, was that the one?
The first last year? Yes. Spore.
Yes.
Yes.
Last Refuge 2, and then yes. So because I remember I was like a primary, like, heavy villager role for that, and I just remember, like, being told one moment, hey, you guys are in really good relationships with Red Team. I'm like, okay, cool. Like, Red Team, here are your posters all over the village. And then 20 minutes later, I would get told on the radio, like, hey guys, like, Red Team shot Jeremy. We absolutely hate Red Team. And then all of a sudden, Red Team, like, they don't know this, and they try and come over and talk, and we just flip the absolute hostile switch on them instantly. Yeah. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to sort of see how just there are other factors coming into play with this. And it's not just going to be hey, post propaganda, or hey, here's like $1,000. Can you like us? I mean, sure, give me $1,000 and I might like you a little bit more.
Mhm.
But I feel like there's gonna be just a more focus on like, hey, you actually have to literally earn this. Like, go out there and do something and bring it back to me. That way, there really is sort of a real trust being formed at that point.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think this is definitely a more in-depth way of doing it, and it's going to be sort of interesting just to see how we keep track of that this time around. I mean, again, it should be rather easy since there's only three of us, but still just trying to be like, okay, if I get hit by a random BB, it's like, well, who was that? Was that ACM? Was that PRN? Like, what just happened?
Yeah.
So there's going to be a little bit of I think I feel like there could be some ups and downs to the scale potentially, but I do like the idea of the scale a lot more than just this, hey, we like you a lot versus no, we just don't like you at all.
Yeah, and I thought, it's also really important to create some consistency in like what are you asking players to do? Because
Yeah.
again, that's another thing that we've experienced in the past. It's like help me find my donkey, and so you just go, help this person walk around the field for 5 minutes, and it's like, okay, we totally love you now,
Yep.
and then one beat stray BB comes in, and now we totally hate you, and like at some point we're like, okay, well, what are we gonna ask these players to do? Because if you're gonna and I mean, you can certainly speak to this too, but like if we're going to put all this effort into making it more Milsim-y,
Yeah.
then also the things that we have to ask them to do have to sort of go in line with that. Like it can't just be like, oh, we've got this serious Milsim and here, wear this chicken suit and go do this thing. It's like that the tone doesn't really match.
Yeah.
And I didn't know if it's not that we can't count on like you and Steph or Jeremy to come up with it on the spot, but we figured it's probably easier to just be like, okay, here's a menu that you can pick from and
Yeah.
go do, this is one you can assign or specific ones too. I think we had some in there that are like specific to, and you have to remind me because it's been a while since I looked at the villager stuff, but like they're specific to each faction, right?
So we had mostly specific to PRN,
Oh
and
yes,
that was
yeah.
because of the fact that where PRN started with a disadvantage, we wanted to kind of offer more for them. And like one of the objectives, like I mentioned, like the whole idea of like filling up a fuel container full of gasoline for the village generator, it made sense for us just to give that to PRN because the fuel station is at the village.
Mm-hmm.
So it didn't make sense for us to give that to ACM. I think we had another one that was also PRN specific, but I don't think we had any ACM specific ones this time around.
Yeah, because I remember this conversation now that we had because we were like, okay, well, firstly, the villagers like ACM better. I think from
Yeah.
a lore perspective, to give some insight as how we sort of thought about this, it's like this village is in the middle of this war between ACM and PRN, and they're afraid that ACM will lose. And if that happens, PRN is basically going to raise their village. But on the flip side, they like ACM better, and they feel like their way of life will be more maintained with them. So
Mhm.
they're leaning on the side of ACM, but they want to see if the ACM is actually capable of dealing a blow to PRN before they
Yeah.
ally themselves with them. Otherwise, they're going to go PRN just from a self-preservation standpoint. And PRN wants the village just from like a public relations standpoint, like a psyop kind of situation. But at the same time, they're like the bad guys, so they don't really care. So we've given the objective to PRN to be like conduct a KLE, find out what they want, give them
Yeah.
nothing. You are not authorized to do anything. And what I'm
Yeah.
really kind of hoping for is that they do promise them stuff like resources, or we have a lot of
Mhm.
props. We'll talk about that now. But like that they'll promise them stuff that they're not supposed to give, and then I can come in and be like, hey, you are not supposed to do that. You have to go back and tell them they can't have it, right?
Yeah.
Because if that happens, that's going to be very emergent because it specifically says in the Frago and in the op board, do not give them anything,
Yeah.
right?
And well, it's funny because I'm interested just to see like how people truly act because I obviously I'm at the open games almost every Saturday, and like hearing the folks who've already pre-registered and have been planning, and like I'll hear some people just being like, "Oh gosh, I can't wait to just stroll in and shoot all these villagers," and I'm like, "I hope you don't mean it." And then I hear other people who are just like, "Yeah, we're just gonna get the villagers on our side, and hopefully they'll take up arms, and that's extra bodies for us." And I'm like, I kind of like that a lot better.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, and like we've told them both, like, and I mean, you guys are allowed to be armed, but like
Yeah.
I'm not expecting, especially at the start, like I'm not expecting you to carry any replicas on you, like on your person, because it's not going to be relevant. You're just at home doing your whatever it is that you do at Robin Sage, like I don't know, make bread or like mine your, farm your field or whatever it is, right? That's all
Yeah.
you're doing. But yeah, it's going to be interesting. And again, like for some players, this is their first time ever doing this. So they might offhand, like you were saying, and be like, I'm just going to shoot all the villagers, not realizing that if you do that, like that is potentially a huge problem for you, especially
Yeah.
if you're PRN. Like that's going to be, if the villagers go hostile, like that's not going to be a great day for
No.
them at all, right?
Oh, so it's gonna be really interesting just to see like how the commanders sort of rein people in a little bit.
Yeah. One of the things that we're definitely doing more of, and I've talked about it, I've mentioned it a few times so far, but is around the props. Like, so the missile is certainly one thing, but
Yeah.
one of the things that as we were talking, we wanted to just go extra. Like, we wanted to give all kinds of things for players to interact with. So, I mean, we brought money back. I ordered more money. It's American money, which I'm not crazy about, but like at the same time, it's the stuff that's most available on Amazon. So, like, whatever. And we're bringing back the idea of like the what do we call, like the medical supplies, like the pills and stuff like that.
Yeah, so like
and
we
like
know
pill
we're just
bottles,
gonna
right?
and like I know we got rid of the self revives.
Yeah.
That's what we were using the candy for last year. But this time just having like med supplies that you can go and get for the villagers. So just like pill bottles filled with candy, big medical bags and stuff like that. So and even just like little things. I mean, like we like just like cell phones and watches and just little things like that. Just it was just the whole idea of like just having people be able to have something that they can use to negotiate.
Yeah.
Right.
And stuff that like tactile stuff that people can interact with, because it's one thing to like scan a case and be told, oh, you just found a case. It contains something that's worth 1,000 points, or well, we don't have points for this game, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it contains this, but it's not actually in there. You just have the case.
Yeah.
Cool. But also like, so what? Right?
Yeah.
Like there's nothing there. Whereas it's like you open the case and it says, hey, you found, ACM intel, and it's an iPad. And you're like, oh, that's cool. So now I've got this case, but now I also have this iPad. Like, what am I going to do with it? And spoiler alert, all our stuff is broken. So it's not, we were able to get like through donos from people like, hey, a couple, ET had a couple of iPads. And it's like, hey, you can use these. And like, you have old cell phones. I have some old cell phones, watches, like stuff like that. You have that old laptop. I've got, if we got hard drives, like it doesn't really matter. Like all of this is pretty easy to acquire. Most people have all kinds of old like tech just kicking around their house. You can just repurpose some of that. Same idea. That's what they do at AMS, right?
And it's just like and like you mentioned like the missile and like how large it is, and like all the components. But it's just like the fact of it gives people something physical that they're actually like having to move and carry and also protect. Technically, like even though it's broken, it's in our world it's broken, but for the sake of this, it's a valuable item to someone on that field. So it's just like, okay, so it's like, oh, I got shot and I'm carrying this laptop. Well, there goes the laptop.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Or you put it down, you have to come back and fight for it or what have you. And like, I think that's something that many people who are listening to this, like if you're considering running a game, like find a prop, make a prop, right? Like that can add a whole lot. And I mean, we've got bags, like you have those like big orange, like first aid bags, essentially that, you know what? Like, it doesn't really matter what's in it. It's just, it looks the part. Or the case of MREs, right? Hey, look, that's MRE supplies, right? Yeah. Like all of that stuff, whether it gets used or not, like we're going to have like cardboard boxes that for like humanitarian supplies, I think, or like, totes, like Rubbermaid totes, just full of stuff. Doesn't really matter what's in it. But it adds, like, hopefully it's going to add some opportunities for players to just engage. And I remember was it the first Last Refuge? Not the first Last Refuge, but the first one back, like Last Refuge 2 or whatever.
Right.
Where some guy watched Jeremy walk around with a case that said TNT on it.
Oh, yeah.
And he's like, that guy has a case that says TNT on it. Am I supposed to do something with that? And be like, I don't know. I'm just the admin. You figure it out. Like, I think that's going to be interesting to see, like, what, if anything, players do, like if they connect the dots. And again, that talk comes back to your point, like, are they even gonna to do that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And Yeah, so it's just, and I don't know, it'll be interesting, like you said, just to see how they even handle it. Because I mean, like for example, like, obviously like, we know like if any of the guys like from the Storm Riders come across, it's like okay, cool, like they know what this is because they are used to it. But you have like, well, obviously we're gonna have people that are as rentals. So all of
Hmm.
a sudden we have rentals who come across this black case and they're like, is this part of Frontline's field? Did someone lose this? Is this actually like? So it'll be just really interesting just to see how just your average person who's newer to airsoft kind of reacts just by seeing these things as well.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it's going to be, and like again, like you're talking about renters and stuff, like
yeah,
they may not know what to expect. So I really hope they pay
hmm,
attention during the briefing, because like
yeah,
really, as we were looking at our objectives too, like there's only really one objective for the day in the middle of the day where we're actually putting the two teams on the same task, right? At like noon ish,
hmm,
both teams are going to have the objective to go find the flight controller, the flight laptop, or whatever we've decided at like the top sniper area. I think that's where we've plotted it, and both
yeah,
teams are going to have that objective, and it's going to be up to them because it's a critical part of the day. But like,
hmm,
no team should be realistically be able to control that all day long, right?
yeah,
So hopefully, depending on how the game plays out, when we assign them these fragos, like there's actually going to be some sort of contact, but that's it. The rest of the
yeah,
day, it's all like, hey, so in fact, we have a couple of even false flags where
yeah,
I think later on, like we're going to send ACM to recover the missile from the villagers or find out where it is. Turns out the villagers have it, and you can do a mission for them or buy it, like depending
hmm,
on how you've managed your money. And
yeah,
then meanwhile, PRN is getting a completely different mission to that tells them that ACM is coming to attack the village. So ideally, the commander will withdraw all the forces to protect their fob from an attack that doesn't actually materialize, because
yeah,
that's not the objective that we gave them, right? So it's going to be interesting as well to see. My only concern, to be honest, like my only concern is that some of the PRN players will get bored. However, the advantage that we have is that the Storm Riders are playing PRN.
yeah,
And so the messaging to Cal outside of, hey, you're the team captain, has been, when you get stuff to do, prioritize giving it to people who aren't Storm Riders so that
yeah,
other people have cool experiences. Because at the end of the day, like I want Jason to have a good time, I want Pat to have a good time,
yeah,
you know, all that's all fine. They're gonna have a good time regardless. But if you
yeah,
got a new guy who just got a ghillie suit for the first time ever and you
yeah,
send him on a recon mission, like I feel like they're gonna feel like hot shit, right? And that's the
yeah.
whole point, I guess, of doing something like that.
But I don't know if they'll. I see. I don't know if they're gonna be that bored because I think once they realize that, well, dang, like ACM is literally spawning at D-Day, which is 50 feet, 75 feet from the new two story.
Yeah,
I think that's going to be a bit of a wake up call right away when they realize that, oh wow, like we have potential contact 75 feet away, but we also have objectives that way down the
yeah,
road. So I don't necessarily know. I mean, I obviously I think for both teams there are going to be just low points. Like I think there's going to be a point where
for
both
sure.
teams just don't have contact, and but again that's the whole point because after Operation Touchdown, people literally wanted something different. They wanted less engagement because Operation Touchdown was just a BB fest.
Yeah,
Like I remember going through a full bag of BBs and I was on gold team who was just supposed to be escorted, but the amount that I still shot was just like, wow.
yeah, yeah. So, you know, like I totally get that, because part of doing touchdown was to test, you know, new mechanics and stuff like
Yeah.
that, but also to see like what does the community really want. And
Yeah.
until that time, I wasn't really convinced that the community cared about role playing, and so
Yeah.
it wasn't a factor. So that, I think, was a good, not a wake up call certainly, but like a call to action. Basically, say, okay, figure out a way to bring this back. And then
Mm-hmm.
for Neon Sunrise, I mean, that was a shorter sort of event, but that's where we finally, you know, for the first time ever, tested the replica weapon classes mechanic.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm super thrilled that people enjoyed it, because we're bringing
Yeah.
it, you know, we're keeping that. I think it's a really good way to make people's investments into DMRs and bolt action snipers and you know, squad support weapons actually
Yeah.
meaningful, right? There's,
Absolutely.
at least currently, there's at the last count there was like at least 20 something players on either team. It's like 25 for one and 23 for the other. So like pretty even, right?
Yeah.
If all the slots that we have fill up, it's going to be 60. But what that
Right.
means is they have access, each team has access to 2 DMRs, 2 bolt
Mm-hmm.
action snipers, and 4 SSWs, which is way more than we actually have in our community, right?
Yeah.
So we're giving them flexibility and saying, hey, you know what, if it's not an SSW, but it does have a box mag, that's fine, whatever.
Right.
They're the only ones who can go full auto, so you want to fill those slots up. But like it actually will have an impact, like if they want to, I can just imagine the scenario, and maybe this is gonna happen. I can imagine Pat or Josh with their SSW around the new 2-story, just basically hosing fire into that top corner just to keep them from crossing across D-Day. Is that really going to be effective? I'm not sure, but I mean, I can imagine that happening for sure.
Yeah,
right?
and that's the thing is, I mean, like people, and I think people got a bit of a wake up call at Neon Sunrise. Again, I wasn't there, but just hearing the conversations when people talked about like, gosh, when they had those 2 SSWs sat up in Village, we couldn't do anything because we didn't have a DMR, we didn't have an SSW, and like obviously there's a bit of you can see a bit of the issues. Like it's okay, oh, we had a DMR guy pre-register, so no one else brought their DMRs, and we were reliant on him. And oh, he doesn't show up, or it's like, oh, we have an SSW who pre-registered, no, he didn't show up. So I get where you can almost see that little bit of a disadvantage, and that's why I have been saying to people with these open games, I'm like, you know what? Like people ask, are like, oh, the DMR slots are full, so I'm going to run my rifle, and I'm like, well, bring your DMR, like because if someone who's registered for the DMR role doesn't show up, there's no reason you can't fill that spot.
Yeah. Yeah, and when I was talking to both of the commanders, I told them the same thing. Like, if you have people who want to swap during the day, they can do that, right? It's not like, all the replicas are going to get chronoed one way or another. So if it's field legal, it's field legal. Leave it at the fob or leave it, at your spawn or whatever, and you want to swap to it, just as long as the numbers match up. And like I was telling them from a game management point of view, and this is a piece of advice for, again, if you're listening to this thinking about running your own game, have commanders that you can have a conversation with about the game, not just about like the missions and what they're doing, but like, hey, I need you to be an ally when it comes to managing the gameplay. So like both Aaron and Cal, I've told them, it's like, listen, you have your Ord bat or whatever, like ready to go. You have all your slots filled. I don't care. Yeah. Right. I trust you guys to manage your slots for all your roles, for your medics, for your whatever. You can do that. I don't need to know. Like, if you want to share it with me, that's fine. Like Cal shared it with me. I think Aaron's going to share his. That's great. But I trust those guys to do it because they're not going to, what are they going to do? Cheat? Like, why? Like, there's no, there's no sense, especially like given those two guys in particular. Like, so having that relationship with your commanders or your team captains or whatever you want to call them, so that you can rely on them to manage their team just from like an logistical point of view. Is really, really helpful, right? I don't have to police them in any way. And you can, for other stuff, you can count on them to enforce the rules and all this kind of stuff, right? But it's hopefully by telling them like, hey, you can switch, and also just being more lenient, right? Like DMR, I'm being pretty strict on. Bolt action sniper rifle, being pretty strict on. Like, you have to have the magnified optic, you have to have the longer barrel. Like it can't just be like just some random M4 with a flip down magnifier and be like, oh, it's DMR. And it's like, no, like it has to look the part. Because you have people who've invested a lot of time and money in making their DMRs. So that's fine. You don't want just some schlub with a short rifle shooting over at like 1.9 joules. Like, it makes no sense, right?
Yeah.
And for bolt action, I mean, that's pretty, we don't have to really worry about that because bolt action is bolt action. But with SSW in particular, like, we really want to make sure that people who are investing into the SSW get first crack at that, because those aren't cheap and they're a real pain in the ass to get up and running correctly and all this kind of stuff. So if you have one that works, you probably want to game it, right? And I know that's the case with Pat, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's like 100% like with how much, like with what Pat has invested into this gun to get it to do what it does. It's like, Pat is going to get that slot over someone with an M4 with a drum mag in it. Sorry, like, I get you bought a drum mag. It's super cool, but you do not see what he's invested in and all this effort. Like, he kind of deserves a little bit more. And
then once all those people are taken care of, then you just open the doors and say, hey, absolutely, you got a drum mag, let's go. That's cool. Yeah. And I think that by doing that and not being too strict, like, you can get more full auto, you can get that coverage that the fire base coverage I'm
Yeah.
talking about, right? That you're looking for, and hopefully that will help. I think
Yeah.
that there are, like, I was looking at the signups, and currently I think both teams had like one or two slots open for all the different roles. So like
Oh wow.
there's still time for people to register and swap and all this kind of stuff. So we'll see
Cool.
what happens on the day of. But
Yeah.
yeah, I'm glad that people like that rule, because I think it's
Hmm.
it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I'm a semi only guy. Like,
Yeah.
I've, even before my Kythera, the amount of times that I went to full auto, I could count on, like, on purpose. Did I sometimes hit my selector and put it in auto by accident? Yeah,
Right. Yeah.
absolutely. But
Well. Yeah.
the amount of times that I actually would switch to auto on purpose, I could count on one hand, right? I even
Yeah.
had it set up on my Spectre back in the day. So even if it was on full auto, if you squeeze the trigger, it would only go semi, and you had to hold it down for then to start going auto, because I'm
Ah.
like, I don't care, I don't use it, right?
Yeah.
But at an op, when you're single fire only and you're getting single fire back, and then someone just opens up with a saw, you're like,
Yeah.
let's go. Like,
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Right. Yeah.
yeah.
And I think what's going to be really interesting. Actually, I'm actually interested that you said that. Both, like, the teams seem to have like a slot open for each one, because what I'm kind of a little hopeful for with us doing like two actual factions of the PRN and ACM is that, and continuing this into next year, into next season, is that we're going to see people actually build their kits around that team.
Yeah.
So for also, if it's if someone on PRN really wants a DMR, but the DMR slots in PRN are always full, maybe they'll be like, you know what, like, I want to play on PRN, I want to be green, but maybe because I have the gun for it, I'm just gonna go buy tan gear and I'm gonna go join the ACM team from now on.
Yeah, you have
So
it backwards, but yeah, yes, absolutely.
yeah,
Colors backwards, yeah.
back goes backwards. Yeah, so it's just gonna be interested to see if we see people always signing up for the exact same team every single time.
Yeah.
Because I think that'd be really cool. Because, I mean, like, you look down in the States, like at like Milsim West or American Milsim stuff, like people there's like cost. Like, usually people, if you play cost, you play cost typically.
Mhm.
Like, unless it's like a one-off time for you, but usually if you're playing every month or so many times a year, you always are on the same team. So I'm really hoping to see the sort of same thing with us having two actual factions, is that people usually always do the same team.
Definitely. And I think last time was the first time that we did the factions. It was
Yeah.
on a smaller scale and stuff. I'm hoping that it picks up from here, because I mean, we've spent a fair amount of time, and I think even when we were planning this event, you and I spent a fair amount of time thinking about what makes logical sense in the context of this fictional universe that we've created, right? Why is it that the villagers of Robin Sage would act in this particular way, given the universe that's been created? Why is it that ACM would have these missions in particular, given the context? And same thing with PRN. Like, we've created this idea, well, it's not really, but like, that the PRN is like the bad guys, right? Which is not necessarily the case, because I mean, good and bad and all this kind of, like, hues are the same, whatever. But anyways,
Yeah.
but all that BS aside, like, there's still like this idea of like, oh well, if I'm ACM, then I'm fighting for the cause of good, and if I'm on PRN, I'm the baddies. Like, some people want to lean into that. And that's what I'm sort of hoping that people look through the lore documents that we created. They look into all the materials that we put out there, and use that for some people to lean into it. Because that's one thing, like, when you think about like AMS, you're talking about costs and all this kind of stuff. If you read the lore, some people, like when we were at Iron Horse, like Sam would tell you, I'm not here for the lore. Because you read the lore and you're like, not sure if I'm cool with that. And some people are like, I don't care. Like, it's not about that. And especially at AMS, where they're fictional factions. It's not like you're at Milsim West, where it's like Rust 4 versus NATO. Like, those are real things, as opposed to AMS, where like we made some stuff up and it's like, okay, whatever, right? Yeah. I'm just hoping that people will read it and go, some people will read it and use that as their opportunity to lean into that a bit more. Like, we've made the media, like the flags, for example, public. People can use that. I'm hoping that maybe people at some point would like print it off and slap it on their gear. Right.
Yeah.
I'm not opposed to the idea of making patches, although it's a very expensive endeavor. So if people wanted something like that, like, that's fine. But like, I'm not going to invest the money into doing something like that until I'm very convinced that people are going to go for it. But
Yeah.
like I can see a world where that happens, or I'm hoping that people will
Hmm.
be willing to your point, sort of like adopt their kit and be like, you know what,
Yeah.
when I play PRN, I'm DMR, and when I'm doing ACM, I've got my SSW, or maybe I'm just a regular rifle. Doesn't really matter. But like
Yeah.
there's no reason you can't do both. And also, eventually, maybe and this is something we can talk about. But like, why not do additional different factions, right? Because
Yeah.
even at uh, AMS, like they have Sierra Dynamics, and which is like black multicam, all this kind of
Hmm.
stuff. They have La Losa, which is like the drug cartel, and so like I don't know what their camo rules are. And then they've got the CDF faction, which is
Yeah.
CDF for life. But like we could also do something like that too, because there are guys in this community, or I shouldn't say guys, there are people in our community who wear black kit. Maybe
Yeah.
they want to have a black team, right?
It's true. Yeah, and it's funny how like you mentioned like the CDF and stuff, because it's really funny how like it's become like a bit of a thing now. Ever since Iron Horse is like jeans, khakis, flannels.
Yeah.
Like, it's become an actual thing now, which is really funny. So yeah, it's just, I mean, but once we have things sort of like set in stone and we actually see how the factions play out, and especially like carrying into next year, because I mean, like again, with the community being so new, just seeing how they, like, first off, seeing what the response from an op like this is, because obviously like this is kind of very much opposite side of the spectrum from Operation Touchdown. Like they are two very, very different events.
Yeah.
So I think just seeing if people prefer this, if they prefer Touchdown, or if they want something sort of in the middle, and then just also seeing like, you know what, like these people played for a year. No, I'm not trying to say that they're not going to come back, but it's been 1 year. Are you dedicated to the sport? Are you going to come
Yeah.
back next year? Right. So, and like the things, I mean, like some people just, they get into it and then they take a year off or two, or they just don't come back, or they put a decade into it. Right. So I
Yeah.
think it's also a big part of it.
And different people want different things from airsoft.
Yeah.
I mean, like, do you enjoy speedsoft? And like, I mean, there's no right or wrong answer, right? Like, do you enjoy speedsoft? Do you enjoy the LARP? Do you enjoy Milsim? Do you
Hmm.
enjoy just objective but shorter days? Like, there's
Yeah.
space for everyone, right? It's just like any
Yeah.
sport. Like,
Yeah.
you pick up running. Do you like running short distance or long distance? Do you like playing hockey? Do you play like, like three aside, or do you like playing the full game? Like, there's just so many variants. And if people experience this, especially some of these newer people, they experience that and they're like, you know what,
Hmm.
like this isn't really for me. Like that's not really what I want to get at airsoft.
Yeah.
I find interacting with NPCs is stressful, which potentially is a thing.
Yeah.
Well, that's cool. Like that's you're entitled to your wrong opinion. I'm just joking. But like that's totally fine. And we also know that there are people in our community who prefer, people who've been here a really long time, who prefer the Milsim objective side, and
Hmm.
they would rather not do like just like, hey, speedsoft, let's go to 15-minute games or 5-minute games, whatever.
Yeah.
So trying to achieving that balance is super, super important to us, because
Yeah.
unlike a lot of those large communities where you can just do whatever game and hey, if you like it, great, show up. And if you don't like it, too bad, don't come. It's like, well,
Yeah.
if we crack 60 players at this event, that would be huge.
Right.
And so the only way that we can keep doing that is by making sure that people want to come back, right?
Yeah. Well, I know
Especially,
for Operation Touchdown, I mean, so I remember at the end doing like a count and speaking with the frontline staff, and there were, not saying that they were all in the field at the same time because people came and went and stuff like that, but they did say that there were 64 actual players on the field that
yep.
day. And then plus, of course, we had a pretty large staff out for touching as well. I mean, obviously, Frontline supplied a lot of the reps, and then we just had some admin staff up in the parking lot and stuff. You, Pat, Michelle, all this stuff. So
Yeah.
we've had So it'll be interesting to see if we do break that Operation Touchdown number. I'm super excited because I mean, and like again, like obviously with the pre-registrations are obviously doing very. It took a while. It took a while to get people registering, it seemed, for a while.
Yeah.
And as the event got closer, it started to fill really, really, really quickly, and which is awesome. And obviously we had to open up more slots, and just sort of seeing like, I mean, like, we're obviously gonna have people who don't show up until day of, like that's just how it is, and they'll end up being on whatever team they end up on.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I think, weather pending, that we should break the Operation Touchdown numbers without counting game staff. So I'm hopeful for that.
Yeah,
And
it's
yeah.
it's really interesting because that's another thing that we tried to do is to create sort of this artificial scarcity to try and get people to sign up more quickly by
Hmm.
saying, hey,
Yeah.
so number one, there's only a certain amount of slots per team. So if you want to get on that team, make sure you get
Yeah.
registered early, which worked kind of okay. I know like Aaron and his team, like the Terra group, they have a lot of players. So they
Yeah.
all flooded the green team because they all want to play together, which is excellent.
Yeah.
And so that was okay. But at the same time, like to your point, like we didn't get everybody. So we didn't run out of tickets, right? Like until pretty recently, we tried to make it so, hey, if you register early, you also get an extra raffle ticket. That sort of
Hmm.
worked. But there's still people registering after, like even in the last couple of days, um, despite the fact that the raffle entry, extra entries, like is passed. So it's really interesting to me. Like the bigger events, they just say, hey, there's this amount of tickets, buy your ticket, and if it's sold out, it's sold out, tough. And
Yeah.
then sometimes they do an extra drop. That's what AMS does. And so we tried to do
Yeah.
something similar, and I'm not necessarily sure if I want to do the same thing again in future. um but yeah, it's always a challenge here is getting people to actually like register and pay,
Yeah.
because that's the other thing too with the frontline system. They can register without pay, which is
Yeah.
kind of crazy. Like I don't think that's how it should be, but
It's
I'm not
yeah.
there to run their business. They can figure out their own stuff. But when
Yeah.
if we ever end up running our own events, for example, at somewhere else, which
Hmm.
fingers crossed in the works,
Yeah.
we would have a system where it's like, hey, you buy a ticket, that's it. You buy a ticket and that's your ticket. You're done, right?
Yeah.
But if you don't buy it, then you don't have a spot, right?
Yeah. And I've obviously a big part for AMS is, I mean, like they have the community for it.
Yeah.
I mean, like I know like our community is definitely like coming up and up, and we're seeing more and more people. I mean, almost any weekend you went to the field this year, I mean, you've probably seen one or two either new rentals playing, or you've seen people who were just coming up with their friends for the very first time, and the following week all of a sudden they had gear, and it's just like, whoa, all right, cool.
Yeah.
Like I'm all about it. So it's nice that we're seeing the community sort of bounce back, because I mean, we've had ups and downs in the airsoft community, and it's nice to see that we're on that sort of up again.
Yeah. So we'll see what Operation Phantom Shield sort of brings out in the community. I'm excited to see like all the stuff we talked about come to life. I think that's
Hmm.
we've been, as I said in the intro, like we've been working really hard for a few months now, just getting everything together, assembling all the kits, like assembling other parts, making sure that all the gameplay stuff works together and is sensible and coherent for when players start to interact with it.
Hmm.
And then like in basically in 5 days, like the rubber's going to meet the road, and we're going to see how people actually interact with that. It's going to be fun to see if anybody actually wins the day outright.
I was gonna
And
say,
yeah,
do you have a faction you're right now thinking like they're taking it home?
I feel like PRN is going to win
Yeah.
just by virtue of the experience that's on that team.
Okay.
When I was looking at like the roster, I
Hmm.
think that about half of the ACM team, this is their first year playing Airsoft.
Hmm.
Now, there's some really great players on that team, and they work
Yeah.
really well together, right?
Yeah.
Not taking anything away from it from anybody, um, but it's still their first year.
Yeah.
If you
And the thing is,
look,
and they have two actual teams technically
yes,
on that team as well.
yeah, they've got Wolfpack and Terra,
Yeah.
right? So these are guys who, and they play Airsoft almost every weekend. They're at the field. They're playing the night games. Like these guys are dialed. Like they're very good players.
Okay.
But I really feel like there's a quality to experience
Hmm.
that is just years of experience, just in terms of how your replica operates and like the kinds of hacks that you can do, like turning your
Hmm.
replica to the side so that you're curving your BB around a piece of cover, stuff like
Yeah.
that,
Nice.
that you just pick up, or like just manipulating your replica around cover, and like the amount of ready ups, like the muscle memory of just
Yeah.
coming up, snap shooting, like just it doesn't necessarily make you a better player, but it's a quality all of its own. And I feel
Hmm.
like if you look at the PRN team, like these are guys, I think over like 8 of them, so 8 out of 20 something, have been playing for at least 6 years or more.
Hmm.
I mean, on the PRN team, you've got Cal, you've
Yeah.
got Jason, you've got Pat. These are guys who've been playing Airsoft almost 20 years.
Yeah,
right?
it's true.
And then on top of that, you've got other people who aren't on the Storm Riders who also have been playing. I think like Sean Stafford, for example,
Yeah.
he's been playing Airsoft for I don't know exactly. I'm going to say at least 8 years,
Yeah.
and he's got like a million guns, right? So there's a
It's true.
lot of experience in him. Anybody else who shows up, like there's several people on that team who I'm just thinking like there's a
Okay.
lot of experience there, and so just by virtue of the fact of the experience in my mind, I
Yeah.
have to sort of give them the edge, but I
Okay.
feel like we've also made it harder for them, right?
Yes. Yeah. Oh, 100%. And
So,
so I think so. I agree with you that PR. I think that at the end of the day, that PRN will take the victory. However, I think the first hour to hour and a half, I think they are going to struggle.
yeah.
I think once they find out the hard way that ACM has two respawn positions, especially when they find out they're respawning on D-Day the hard way, I think that they are going to struggle with movement at that point, and they're going to get a little. I think they're going to get a little bit bogged down for the first little bit. But I do think by end of the day that, again, as you mentioned, like on experience, like again, when you talk about Cal and Pat and Jason, I mean, these are capable guys who can make a plan to resolve being bogged down.
Hmm.
Just give them the time and give them. Then again, there's the big communication factor, of course, as well. Is that once they have time to communicate and sit down and talk about it. So I think I do agree. I think PRN will take it home based again big mostly on the experience. But I think we're going to see them struggle at the first
Yeah.
big first quarter of the day.
And I'm definitely rooting for ACM. Like I'm rooting for Parsons and his group. I think that I would love to see them
Yeah,
come out with a win. I think
yeah,
that would be just really really cool for them. I think their objectives are definitely feasible for one thing, but I
yeah,
think they're more interesting. Like there's a lot for them to do,
yeah.
and so yeah, I would love to see them. I mean, they get the missile too, and I've put a lot of work into that thing.
Yeah.
So like, I want them to love that
Little
too.
bias.
Yeah.
So I would have picked ACM if Parsons didn't say that he was going to come shoot me in the village. So if it
Oh
wasn't for
yeah.
that,
Well.
it's a personal vendetta now. So it's out of that. I need ACM to actually lose because of that.
Yeah.
So
Fair enough. Well, listen, Kirby, thanks for coming on and talking to me about this.
yeah,
We'll have to do a debrief once the
yeah.
game is done and talk about some of our surprises and see whether or not our predictions came true.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. And I mean, I'm sure it'll be great to talk about the raffles and how the sponsors and stuff went as well
yeah,
afterwards. So yeah, it'll
definitely, because it's the first time being sponsored, which is awesome. So we'll be
yeah.
talking to that on the actual
Absolutely. Yeah,
episode.
no,
Yeah.
so it was good to be on here. I mean, first time, and I know I always hide in the background, so it's interesting to be out in the front, I guess, of everything for once.
Yeah, man. Well, it's good to have you on.
Thank
Thanks for
you.
agreeing. And guys, that's all we've got for you this week. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next week. Take care.